Cartels operate a bit differently from other organizations. It's a place where a simple agreement is treated as an oath. Disloyalty means death, and resignation means only one thing: war. From deals gone bad to honest resignations, here's what happens when you try to leave a cartel. El Cholo.
Enrique Sánchez Martínez, alias El Cholo, originario de Guadalajara, Jalisco.
March 18th, 2021, the entire country was awoken to the news that El Mencho had finally captured his former friend turned arch-nemesis, El Cholo. In this video shocking the world, El Cholo was made to mention names of people who aided his betrayal, and those names would shock you. Around 2010, the Jalisco New Generation cartel not only sprung up, but would also grow exponentially throughout the years. As of right now, it is by far the most brutal and one of the most feared cartels in the world. This rapidly growing cartel led by El Mencho, real name Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, would take over control of this cartel after the arrest of its previous leader, Ignacio Coronel Villarreal. In 2011, El Mencho assumed leadership of the CJ&G, along with El Cholo as his sidekick, confidant, and wingman. But years before that, they were just two innocent kids who hung out all the time. This led them to create an unbreakable bond, and ultimately, to lead the CJ&G with an iron fist. El Cholo was El Mencho's executioner, taking direct orders and implementing them in the interest of the CJ&G. His role as second in command came with a lot of its privileges, like access to the internal structure and even some financial perks. Everything seemed rosy until El Cholo began exploiting these privileges. Now, he began taking out some of his personal enemies with the artillery of CJ&G, and in the name of El Mencho, creating more war for the gang to deal with. And as if that wasn't bad enough, he also began to steal from his own boss, which is that one line that mustn't be crossed with El Mencho. A guy named Marco Hernandez, acting as the cartel's accountant, noticed some discrepancies in the financial records and immediately informed El Mencho. El Cholo got a whiff of what Marcus had done, and yet again, by abusing his power, El Cholo ordered his execution, and this would mark the end of that relationship. The CJ&G, which was his home, became very uncomfortable for him. His overambitiousness had driven him into becoming a sworn enemy of the cartel. El Cholo knew for a fact that he could no longer stay in or around the CJ&G for obvious reasons. He became a walking target, and he knew if he stayed, it was only a matter of time before he was killed. March 2018, he began convincing several disloyal members of that cartel to break away, and with them he formed his own organization, the Nueva Plaza Cartel. Now, that sudden move was motivated by a former associate of El Mencho, Eric Valencia Salazar. So after bypassing chain of command and stealing from his own boss, El Cholo and Eric would also come up with the genius plan of starting war against El Mencho. This created a chain reaction of hate and retribution, and best believe El Mencho was ready. In El Mencho's usual fashion, he sent in a strike team, comprising some of the most lethal and bloodthirsty executioners, with only one objective in mind: eliminate El Cholo. Now, this was supposed to be an easy task, according to the CJ&G, because they thought El Cholo was alone. However, they had no clue about the extensive stockpile of ammo that he had gathered, and when the strike team got to that target, they were met with a troop armed to the teeth waiting for him. Luckily for El Mencho, he didn't lose any soldiers, but that encounter wasn't enough to end the war. In June 2019, the CJ&G launched yet another attack against the Nueva Plaza cartel and El Cholo, only to suffer yet another miserable defeat. Not only did they fail to achieve their objective, but they also experienced the brutal retaliation from El Cholo. Many returned home with injuries, and to add insult to injury, El Cholo brutally murdered the head of the strike team. Now, this act wasn't only a display of dominance, but also a blatant defiance against El Mencho, his former boss. So El Mencho perceived that as the ultimate insult and retaliated by unleashing the full force of the CJ&G on El Cholo. What began as a battle of betrayal quickly escalated into a full-blown war. Acknowledging his lack of weapons, manpower, and money, El Cholo made a move to ally with the archenemy of El Mencho and the CJ&G, the Sinaloa cartel. This cartel was the only real threat they had. The CJ&G had become one of the most powerful cartels in the world, but the Sinaloa cartel was the only one preventing them from taking complete control of the drug trade. El Mencho knew that the Sinaloa cartel would be eager to to oppose him, being a significant obstacle to their operations. Now, not only were they his opponents, but they also had the advantage of insider information provided by El Cholo. This made them an even bigger threat. True to his suspicions, the Sinaloa cartel seized the opportunity presented by El Cholo and began using him to disrupt CJ&G operations. In exchange, they financed his new cartel, the Nueva Plaza. This gave him a significant advantage in both the markets and the fields. El Cholo and his gang relentlessly attacked the CJ&G, forcing them to temporarily cease operations. This betrayal fueled El Mencho's determination to seek revenge against El Cholo. The conflict escalated, causing casualties on both sides and significant damage to civilian life and infrastructure, particularly in the Guadalajara metropolis and the state of Jalisco. As El Mencho focused on planning and executing strategies to eliminate his enemy, El Cholo resorted to bribing corrupt police chiefs and politicians for protection, which provided temporary safety but ultimately failed to keep El Mencho at bay. March 18, 2021, the world was awoken by a video of El Cholo. This man was captured by his former boss, and his confession was being filmed by the CJ&G. In this video, he began talking about people who helped him in his betrayal, and to the surprise of many, he mentioned police chief Omar Garcia. According to El Cholo, because of Omar's help, he could go on a rampage without fear of any form of consequence. And boy, did he go far. He went as far as planning a bomb at the American consulate, executing other rival cartel leaders, and wreaking havoc unchallenged. His confession video shook the whole of Mexico, and on the same day, his body was found on a bench in the park. And while you might be trying to wrap your head around that whole story, the news of his death wasn't the worst of things. It's how he died, where the real horror lies. The autopsy report would show gruesome details, revealing that he endured extreme torture during the last 48 hours of his life in a true CJ&G style. This man was kept alive medically, prolonging the suffering as much as possible, and he went through untold levels of pain, as he had endured broken bones and some of the most vile torture methods known to man. And when his captors were satisfied, they ended his life with 3 bullets to the head. El Cholo's overambition led to the loss of his position, assets, and friends, ultimately costing him his life. This just means one thing and one thing only: never mess with the CJ&G. Amado Carrillo Fuentes. June 1985 marked the beginning of the end for Amado, being apprehended for the unauthorized possession of a weapon. He was stopped at the U.S.-Mexican border, and a patrol guard found an AR-15 assault rifle in his trunk. However, something really random happened, which altered the course of his life from that moment on. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, better yet known as the Lord of the Skies, was one of the most prolific drug lords in Mexico. This guy was the leader of the Juarez cartel, gaining his nickname from the extensive use of airplanes as a means to smuggle large amounts of narcotics into the U.S. through the Mexican border. Born in 1956 in Mexico to a large family that had a history of dealings with drugs, El Señor de los Cielos grew up around many criminals and was doomed to a life of crime. You see, Carrillo was Don Neto's nephew, the Guadalajara cartel's leader. He left his hometown at the daring age of 12 after losing both parents and moved in with a few acquaintances. But due to how badly he was treated, he swore never to return home until he was wealthy. Now his first move was to join his uncle, Don Neto, at the Guadalajara cartel. Eventually, he started getting involved in the drug business under his tutelage. When he began to see substantial success, he would bring in his brothers, and eventually his son, Vicente. After 2 years in the narcotics underworld, Amado left his uncle to work for Rafael Aguilar Gallardo. Amado's approach was so well hidden, to the extent that not only did he bribe more than half of the Mexican police ranks to ensure the smooth running of his operations, but he had also become one of them. And while that in itself was incredibly daring, he didn't stop there. After 5 years on the force, he was taken to the Federal Security Directorate, which is considered Mexico's highest-ranking police force. In May 1996, at the U.S.-Mexican border, Amado was caught with an AK-47, but this issue wasn't exactly escalated because he carried a DFS identification, giving the reason why he wasn't held in detention for too long. However, something would happen that would cause major problems for Amado's covert life. The mugshot, which was taken on that day, was believed to be the earliest known record of Carrillo's appearance. His quiet life played a major role in his success, and according to reports, he had a net worth of approximately $25 billion. In July 1997, his life and leadership of the Juarez cartel took a turn for the worse. A crisis sparked over allegations of politicians aiding drug cartel operations for personal gains. There were widespread protests around the country, with one instance involving the then governor of Morelos, Jorge Orea, who was perceived as being lenient and accommodating in matters concerning these cartels. The photograph of Amado served as a critical reference point in the heated national debate that followed, and very quickly Amado went from being a favored underground boss whose name was whispered in hushed tones to having a target right on his back, and since he was nowhere to be found, his planes were targeted on numerous occasions. By the late 90s, Mexico had already become too hot for him, and his end was closer than he could have ever imagined. January 13, 1995, the government launched targeted undercover operations to completely destroy cartels in retaliation for the peak rate of drug trafficking and organized crime. Under the new president, Ernesto Zedillo, the crackdown increased, which led to increased pressure on the Juarez cartel, and by extension, on Amado also. Now all of Mexico could finally put a face to the name Amado. He was linked to the murder of about 400 people, and there was no doubt the government was determined to put him behind bars. This prompted him to change his appearance so he could try to fly under the radar once again. July 4th, 1997, at Santa Monica Hospital in Mexico. To alter his appearance, Amado decided to undergo plastic surgery and abdominal liposuction. It surely was a desperate move, but at that point his concealed identity had been made public. So after about 8 hours of surgery and up to 5 gallons of fat removed, Amado died barely a week later. Today his death is surrounded by multiple theories. One was that he faked it, or maybe he died of a heart attack. But the scariest of them all was that the cartel tactfully eliminated him because of the fact that his identity had been exposed, meaning the entire cartel's operation could have been exposed. So this theory kind of made sense because he had escaped many assassination attempts and a manhunt before his death. November 7th, 1997, a few months after the death of Amado, the bodies of the 2 surgeons who had conducted his surgery were found dead. They were horrifically encased in concrete within steel drums, showing evident signs of torture. Jose Arechiga Gamboa, January 3, 2014. The Netherlands Ministry of Security and Justice and the Mexican Embassy in the country confirmed that a 33-year-old Mexican citizen arriving at Amsterdam under a false name had been arrested by Dutch police. While authorities wanted to keep that case private, the information leaked through Mexican newspapers, and this was the man many say killed for fun. Jose Gamboa. June 15, 1980, was the day Jose Gamboa, better yet known as El Chino Antrax, was born. And while most cartel members are immediately introduced to the culture of criminality at a very young age because of hardship or their environment, El Chino walked a very different path. He was not born into gangster life. He grew up with respectable working-class parents. But when your next-door neighbors are the Zambada family, there's only so much you can do. The head of that family, Ismael Zambada, otherwise known as El Mayo, was one of the founding members of the Sinaloa cartel, and his 3 sons were all part of the business. The Zambada boys were all within the same age group as El Chino, so naturally this would influence his lifestyle. Around August 1997, he would start working for the Sinaloa cartel as a bodyguard for his childhood friend, Vicente Zambada Niebla, until 2008. Following the separation of the Sinaloa and Beltran Leyva cartels that year, he went on to form Los Antrax, which was an armed section of the Sinaloa cartel, providing security for El Mayo himself. In a bid to impress the cartel boss, El Chino became even more vicious in his activities to ensure that his business continued as usual. His thirst for blood and gross violence was second to none, and within a short time he became the cartel's highest-ranking hitman. Unfortunately, that reign of terror wouldn't last long. December 2013, El Chino was captured by Dutch police arriving from Latin America under the false name Norberto Siqueiros Garcia. area. Now, this arrest was made at the request of U.S. authorities, and when they caught him, he was carrying an iPhone 5, a BlackBerry Bold, 3 airplane tickets, credit cards, and a Mexican driver's license. He was immediately sent to Vut Maximum Security Prison. U.S. law enforcement was able to identify El Chino through some advanced forensic methods, despite the fact that the drug lord had used a fake name to travel, changed his physical appearance, and altered his fingerprints. January 2nd, 2014, El Chino appeared before a judge, who spoke about his situation and the motives behind his arrest. Subsequently, the Dutch authorities confirmed that the drug lord had been arrested without the knowledge of Mexican officials, at the request of the U.S. government and with the help of Interpol. The U.S., wasting no time, immediately solicited an extradition request to bring the drug lord to the U.S. That request was granted, and just 6 days later, the U.S. Department of Justice sanctioned the drug lord under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act, aka the Kingpin Act, resulting in the freezing of any assets he may have held in the U.S. Now, this sanction also prohibited all citizens from carrying out financial or commercial dealings with him. The document alleged that, besides working for El Mayo, El Chino also worked alongside other Sinaloa cartel high-ranking enforcers, like their leader, El Chapo. And on March 20th, 2015, El Chino reappeared in court and pled guilty to all the charges against him. He was requested to forfeit a huge amount of money, and more importantly, El Chino gave out very useful details that helped authorities clamp down on the activities of the Sinaloa cartel. In fact, on the day he was sentenced, he seemed remorseful, promising the judge to turn a new leaf. He said, and I quote, "I'm truly ashamed. I promise you, I will never go the wrong way again. I would like to be able to work honestly." Well, the judge believed him, and based on his cooperation with investigators, El Chino was only given 7 years and 3 months in prison. Now, if one thing is for certain, snitching on the Sinaloa cartel was a huge mistake that would never go unpunished. March 3rd, 2020, he was released on the condition that he'd remain under federal parole supervision for the next 5 years. But in this shocking twist, a few days after he was released, he absconded to Sinaloa, Mexico, to live with his sister Ada Jimana Gamboa and her husband Juan Garcia. Immediately after he went missing, an arrest warrant was issued in his name, and while it is a mystery why he chose to forfeit U.S. protection to flee to Sinaloa, where he had previously claimed to have severed all ties, the rank and file of the Sinaloa cartel had followed the court proceedings with keen interest. Seeing how he exposed their secrets to the authorities, they began looking for payback. So when news broke out that El Chino had escaped, they saw it as their opportunity to teach him a lesson. May 6th, 2020, local Mexican authorities found the dead bodies of El Chino, his sister, and her husband after their kidnapping a few days prior. Their lifeless bodies were found in a BMW without plates in Culiacan. Authorities didn't assert who was behind the kidnapping and assassination, but it was pretty clear as to which cartel may have been the perpetrators. Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes, September 11th, 2004. What started as this beautiful day quickly turned to a day filled with sorrow. Rodolfo, his wife, and his daughter had decided to go to the mall to see a movie. It was his way to cool off the tension he was dealing with from rival gangs. But as they were on their way out, they were ambushed and killed. Born July 20th, 1975, in the small Sinaloan town of Guamuchilito in Mexico, to Vicente Carrillo and Aurora Fuentes, Rodolfo was nicknamed El Niño, meaning the golden boy, because his elder brother was none other than Amado Carrillo Fuentes. So he got preferential treatment from everyone in the cartel. However, after his brother had died in 2004, a war of interest broke out, and anyone who saw himself as a viable opposition was gunning for the top spot to become the leader of the Juarez cartel. Now, this led to an internal strife among the members of that cartel, and if that wasn't enough, Rodolfo, who was supposed to take over the affairs, would go on to leave the Juarez cartel and try to start his own criminal enterprise. But being a longtime member of the Juarez, there was no way the leadership was going to let that happen without a fight. This guy had in-depth knowledge of their inner workings and was unwilling to change his mind about his departure. Now, even though Vicente had put Rodolfo in charge of being a liaison for other cartels, he didn't feel safe because he really couldn't trust anyone. It felt as though everyone merely accommodated him and wouldn't fail to hurt him if there was ever a need. Many factors would create discomfort, such as personal conflicts with other members over power dynamics, control of drug trafficking routes, and many other issues. Trying to leave the cartel and start his own was a means to ensure his survival, even if it meant teaming up with his worst enemy, El Chapo. But Rodolfo supported Chapo's ambition to dominate the entire drug trafficking network in Mexico. In return, Chapo sought to capitalize on Rodolfo's underground expertise and experience to increase profits. However, beyond mere financial gain, El Chapo's prominence in the drug trade also meant he wielded considerable danger. Crossing his path as an adversary meant risking your life, and given the notorious history of violence and crime, extending a hand of friendship to him seemed miraculous. During a face-to-face negotiation, Chapo disclosed his intentions to lead a federation of drug cartels in Mexico, a proposal to which Rodolfo objected. Following a tense meeting that ended unfavorably, El Chapo attempted to extend a handshake to Rodolfo, only to be rudely ignored, leaving his hand hanging awkwardly. Well, that snub embarrassed Chapo and would further escalate tensions. To make it worse, Rodolfo then shot one of El Chapo's mercenaries, provoking Chapo's thirst for revenge. September 11, 2004, Rodolfo and his wife were watching a movie with their daughter at this cinema complex. However, Rodolfo abruptly changed his mind just as the movie started, because he had already developed a bad case of paranoia due to all the events happening around him. So he forced his family to leave early, but as they left the complex and went towards the parking lot, they walked right into an ambush. Surrounded, he had no cards left to play. He and his wife were brutally shot at point blank and killed instantly. After the attack, the gunman fled the scene, leaving a heartbroken daughter with the lifeless body of her parents.